Good morning and welcome to the client-side track. I'm pleased to introduce this morning Robert Hansen and Josh Sokol with HTTPS Can Bite Me. And the speakers have requested that you hold questions until the end as they have a lot of information to go through. Enjoy.
Hello everybody, can you hear me? Yes?
Check.
Excellent. So, yeah, my name is Robert Hansen. I run a company called Sec Theory out of Austin, Texas. I also run Hackers and Slackers. I also go by RSnake.
I'm Josh Sokol. I'm the Information Security Program Owner for National Instruments and Austin OWASP President.
So the whole point of this presentation is we're going to be talking about HTTPS and not the client, not the like VPN sort of types of SSL, not things that are embedded or whatever. We're just talking about the browser implementation of HTTPS. So just setting expectations here. We are not going to be doing any demos because frankly I'm scared of the demo gods. And also a lot of demos, you know, there's something to actually see. Well, with most man-in-the-middle attacks you don't really see anything. So we went back and forth and we decided we have way too much stuff to cover anyway. So no demos. I hope that doesn't piss anyone off too much, but you'll get a lot of good stuff.
All right, so what's wrong with SSL anyways? So last year, 2009, Taher El-Gamal, the inventor of SSL, was asked by a ZDNet reporter his thoughts on SSL man-in-the-middle attacks and the ability to intercept session cookies. And this is what he said. He said, I think all these problems have to do with browser design rather than security or protocol. It's interesting because SSL gets blamed for all the stuff, but they are actually not even related to SSL. And while Robert and I agree that most of the issues are browser related, it's kind of unfair to ignore some of the SSL or TLS specific issues. So we get to this. You know, back in 1995, SSL 2.0 came out, numerous vulnerabilities. Adam Shostak had an article where he addressed some of the SSL ineffectiveness at protecting users once compromised. Then comes along 1996, SSL 3.0 from Netscape. IETF actually went, built SSL 3.0, and then later on TLS 1.0 in 1999. And then we go 2 more revisions since then, and we still have issues with SSL and TLS. There are still flaws in it. So here's the promise of SSL and TLS, and it's good intentions, right? It's supposed to do good things. It's supposed to prevent eavesdropping and tampering. It's supposed to provide us with endpoint authentication, communications confidentiality. Those are all good things. Unfortunately, that's simply not the case. So we start out here, and this is how a user finds an SSL site. So these problems begin even before the protocol is actually negotiated. So the user goes, they type in http www.bank.com, and immediately we have our first issue, which is a DNS lookup, right? We have to find our site, and that's in plain text. And then we get a response, which is in plain text. And then we get an HTTP request, which is in plain text. And then we have an HTTP response, again plain text, which gives us a redirection. Finally, we get to the point where we're negotiated. So there's a lot of space here for a man-in-the-middle style attack where they can actually intercept this traffic, they can modify things before we ever get to the encrypted pages. And here's one of those tools Moxie Marlinspike created. It's called SSL Strip. And basically the idea here is the man-in-the-middle can pull out secure links or redirects. And so if you're going to a website and you're basically going to start off at an HTTP place, and there's going to be a link on that page that's going to redirect you to some sort of HTTPS login page. Well, the problem is using SSL Strip, a man-in-the-middle can pull those links out. So here we see HTTPS loginbank.com. That gets changed to http login.bank.com. And the thing here is the user is none the wiser, unless if they're actually checking for, you know, the lock, or, you know, sometimes there's a background color change, something like that. So using a program like this, you're basically able to pull out all the stuff that a user would be able to use to maintain that confidentiality. A user now has to explicitly type in HTTPS in order to get to the page that they want to get to. So now we talk about SSL renegotiation. This was found by Martin Rex and Marsh Ray, and this was found late 2009. And originally this was dismissed as being too theoretical to actually do anything. And then this Turkish grad student comes out named Anil Kurmus, and he actually creates a successful attack against Twitter, fairly large site, right? And he basically uses the authentication of a user and essentially does SSL renegotiation in order to steal the user's credentials. That's a pretty big flaw. And I want to note that this is a flaw in the TLS protocol itself. This is not a browser-related flaw here. So there are issues here with SSL and TLS, the protocol, right? So the idea here is that an attacker inserts text at the beginning of an SSL stream with each negotiation. Flip to the next slide.
So there was a lot of noise last year about CNNIC, which is the Chinese telco, or sorry, Chinese root cert rather, because people didn't trust China or whatever. But the irony is, immediately above it is Xinhua Telecom, which is Taiwanese telecommunications. So it doesn't really make sense. If you really don't trust foreign governments, you probably should pay attention to what's in here. And there is a ton of foreign government certs in here. But most interestingly, in Firefox, which a lot of hackers out there use, and a lot of that noise came from hackers, we've had the Hong Kong root cert in there for quite a while. So it's just like, who do you really trust? And if you don't remove these people from there, you're implicitly trusting whoever owns these or whoever can subpoena them or tell them to give up those credentials with your security. So Intrepidus Group found a really interesting example of how you could leverage the resellers against the person you're trying to man the middle. So they attacked Startcom. This vulnerability is no longer there. But using basically burp proxy and changing one parameter, they were able to create any wildcard cert for any domain they felt like just by having it email them instead of the actual SSL admin at whatever domain.com. So they had a couple examples where they took PayPal and VeriSign.com root certs. So it's pretty bad.
So now we take this a step further, and in late 2008, Alex Soderov and his team came up with this thing basically using MD5 collisions. And they wrote a paper, it's called MD5 Considered Harmful Today, Creating a Rogue CA Cert. They used 200 PlayStations, and they took advantage of these collisions. They spent a few $100s in new certificates, and they found out this rapid SSL random number generator really wasn't random. And so on these 200 PlayStations, about 1 to 2 days or so, they were basically able to create a fully trusted certificate from a man in the middle to read and tamper with the data. And all of the affected CAs have switched now. They're no longer using MD5, they're using SHA-1 at this point or something better. But this was a big issue, right?
Interestingly, if you actually go into Firefox and you look at which certs you have, Alex's and his team's cert is actually in your browser right now. It's just that these two buttons, or 3 buttons rather, are unclicked, which basically gives it no authority to do anything. But that was their solution, rather than fixing some other, revoking it or do something else to get rid of it. Because it is a collision with an existing certificate, they just basically authorized it, but gave it no authority to do anything else.
So this story scares me, and it should scare you guys too. This was broken by Chris Sogam at the FTC, and basically they are selling an actual hardware device, and this device advertises that government agencies can compel a certificate authority to issue false certificates, or they can basically create their own certificates. They can covertly intercept and hijack secure web-based content using this technology, right? So this is not a theoretical concern at this point. This is actual technology that is in existence. You can go out, Packet Forensics, and you can buy one of these devices that'll actually create certificates and sit in the middle. So this is likely in active use out there.
Why would they productize it if it weren't being used?
Yeah.
So if you see this thing in your network, you kind of know what's going on.
Yeah. Be careful.
Yeah. So there's kind of a bunch of UI problems around it. I'm not going to talk about 99% of the UI issues, but One example is fave icons. A lot of people just say look for the lock. Well, that's very easy to get around. Other things like iPhones, for instance, there's really no way to tell what you're allowing. In this case, it looks like you're allowing hackers.org, which you would never trust anyway. So it's like, okay, I'm not going to put any sensitive data in there to begin with. So sure, I'll trust the cert because I'm not putting anything in there. What you're actually doing there is accepting Bank of America. It's an iframe that's it's not telling you that it's Bank of America related, but there's really no way for a user to identify the difference. There's a lot of bad user experience stuff out there. This is Chrome's document that the warning you get when you get a SSL TLS mismatch error with Bank of America. And stuff like this, Google Chrome can say for sure that you reached www.bankofamerica.com, but cannot verify that it is the same site as bofa.com, which you intended to reach. That is just the worst written sentence on the face of the planet. So if a user actually were trying to figure out what was going on and they were actually reading this kind of type of text, which I'm sure no one has ever read, but if you had, you would have certainly been very confused. Here's another example of just bad implementation. So if you go to https://youtube.com, the YouTube SSL TLS version of their website, you'd expect to either see something that's SSL TLS related or get nothing, if they didn't support it. But what you actually get is a SSL TLS mismatch error because they use a wildcard cert for google.com. So they just apparently they have a single QA person looking at their open ports. It's a little weird, but also there's weird UI issues within Firefox. For instance, it says permanently allow this exception, and that's by default. And it's kind of weird if you click it, and if it'll kind of stutter step, and it'll actually check it again. So even if you kind of think you've unselected it, sometimes it'll reselect itself. So there's a lot of weird UI stuff within the browsers. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that we're not going to talk about in this presentation. This is all just the history, getting us to where we are today. So SSL TLS relies on unencrypted email, which sort of kind of defeats the purpose. For like live.com has any sort of webmail server. You can get things like SSL admin at, and you can get a wildcard cert for live.com, for instance. We're not going to be talking about that SSL rebinding stuff that Alex Sordov and those guys talked about at CanSec West. Really good technology. Just kind of flips you back and forth. If you can't if the attacker can't get a EB cert, they can get a lower class cert and kind of switch it back and forth. It kind of blinks really quick. We're not going to be talking about the negative UI issues. There's Jake Graver did an excellent speech on this. I'm sure if you guys ping him about it, he'll give you all the information. We're not going to talk about the questionable activity of delivering EXEs over HTTP. That happens quite a bit. Maybe they're signed, maybe they're not. What the value of that is or not. We're not going to be talking about, like I said before, any things like iTunes or SSH or anything that uses SSL TLS as a library. We're just talking about the browser. We're not talking about strict transport security. There's a whole bunch of problems with it, but we're not talking about it. We're not talking about how cookies are HTTP most of the time anyway. So like Facebook, for instance, you log in securely, but your cookies are still over HTTP. So a bad guy can still log into your account just like they, we're not going to be talking about how cross-site scripting breaks the whole security model of SSL TLS much. There's a little bit of XSS kind of near the end. Once upon a time, there's a great book called what am I thinking? Bruce Schneier's book. What am I thinking? Jeez. It was a late night. It wasn't that late, but it was. I just didn't sleep very well. It's called Applied Cryptography. You might have heard of it. And he had this example where he was saying, if you have a perfect crypto system, there might be a chance where you can still infer stuff about what's going on. So his example was you have like a major who sends out some encrypted piece of information that you can intercept but you can't read to a bunch of people, and those people then send similar messages or different messages, but maybe similar sized or something, to many other subordinate people, or maybe they're not subordinate people, but you can sort of infer that there's kind of a chain of command. It might be just somebody who really wants to encrypt their nude pictures to their buddies or something, but chances are, if you're talking about military organization, that's probably a hierarchical structure. Well, you sort of run into the same sorts of issues when you're talking about HTML. So HTML is sort of the thing you immediately get, obviously HTTP above that, but once you get an HTML document, it sort of makes your browser make a bunch of requests. Things like JavaScript, which can actually ask for more JavaScript or images, for instance. CSS, which can ask for bindings or more images. Objects can ask for Flash or more images, and so on. So there's a lot of sort of back and forth that the browser does that kind of leaks information if you're a man in the middle.
All right, so there's some major problems for an attacker to overcome when they're trying to mount one of these inference attacks as man-in-the-middle. So to start with, you have ciphered content piggybacking on single sockets, which means that it's really difficult to tell where one packet ends or one message ends and where another one begins. Next we have noisy browsers, right? So you have content coming from all over different places, favorite icons, headers, all sorts of different stuff. So it's really hard to see through that noise, and you have to figure out ways to kind of dull down that noise.
And it comes through multiple sockets as well.
Right. And then next you have no referring URLs once the user leaves HTTPS. So there's no way once they're out to tell where they came from, which makes it really difficult. And then lastly, there's no way to inject content or commands, supposedly, because of the integrity requirement. And that means that we can only mount an attack through observation. We can't really do stuff to that message.
Or you're not supposed to be able to anyway.
Yeah. So the initial idea for this presentation was that we were going to do this passive inference of data through man-in-the-middle, and Robert and I are talking, and we're like, hey, this is a really cool topic, right? And then they came out with this paper, and it's a fantastic paper. I encourage everybody to read it. But Robert and I ended up going drinking, crying into our beers, and finally we decided, okay, they took it pretty far, but we can take this a little bit further. They didn't talk about some of the ways that you can restrict those channels and make things more visible as a man-in-the-middle.
And by the way, their math is incredible, way beyond what I would have done anyway, so they did a great job.
Hopefully you have a lot of time when you read this paper. So basically these guys postulated that you could look at the size difference in HTTPS traffic in order to determine what data was initiated by the user or the server, if requests were timed or not. And they did a whole bunch of experiments. They used a healthcare site, and they basically mapped out the healthcare site, and they decided that you're able to actually determine what medicine a person is taking, or what procedures they're doing, or what doctor types they're visiting, just by this inference attack, by looking at the size of the packets and the number of packets going across the wire. In attack site, they were able to look at income and medical bills and things like that, and then they look at an investment site, and they're actually able to look at privacy information, things like that. So we ended up changing our presentation to include some of this stuff and a whole bunch of other techniques, which we're going to talk about here in a sec. So basically what I did here is we create a page in the browser, and we can send it a number and say, I want to send a GET request of this size. And we had a similar page for post sizes. And then I used Wireshark to record that information and then create a Perl script that would actually parse through that information, determine the timing, which we then mapped into an Excel spreadsheet and came up with these pretty graphs.
It's important to note that the post is sending a bunch of data, whereas GET is receiving a lot of data in our examples.
So in this particular example, we have a GET request. It was 100,000 bytes. And you can see here, first off, you can see it's kind of spiky, right? And you can see that in this case, the ingress traffic is more than the egress traffic. So like Robert said, because the ingress is higher, you're actually able to determine it's a GET request because you're getting information, right? So basically we compared the number of packets inbound versus outbound over time. You get a nice pretty graph like this. Now if you look at the post request, it actually comes up very different. So in this case, right, we're posting data, we're actually sending data out there. So you can see here the egress is actually bigger than the ingress. And so when you look at that, you're able to tell, is somebody sending data or somebody receiving data? There's a slight difference on these graphs, and it's possible that it had to do, we were testing on an asynchronous DSL connection, so upload to the server is probably faster than the download. So that might explain some of the differences there. But you can definitely tell the difference between post and GET just by looking at the size of the packets. So here what we did is we actually mapped out the packets by size. This is the total number of packets. It's from 10,000 bytes all the way up to 100,000 bytes. And the first thing you notice here is there's more ingress than egress, right? So this is a GET request. We can tell that automatically just looking at this guy. And then you can see that there's a real nice diagonal line there, which means that we can predict with relative accuracy the request size by the number of packets. So automatically you can infer how big the request was just by looking at the number of packets going back and forth from the browser to the server.
And the variance is due to the jitter in SSL and TLS,
right.
The extra padding.
Now this also works for smaller requests. So I mapped out from 1,000 bytes up to 10,000, and it's not quite as clear ingress versus egress at this level. You have to do some of the looking at the timing of these things in order to figure that out. But there's definitely still a nice diagonal line, and you can see, you know, if I'm at 10 packets, then it's probably closer to the 1,000 level. Or if it's, you know, closer to 20, then we're probably pushing on 100,000. So it's fairly or 10,000. It's fairly easy just to look at the number of packets in order to determine the size of the actual request. And we can infer this down to the 1,000K range. If you did some packet analysis with more optimizations, then it may be possible to get this down even further. This is just the raw data. Let's look at what comes back and forth. So with some of the other techniques that we're going to talk about, you can probably get this down even below that 1,000 level. And then here we have time-based requests. So the idea here is that we can also look at things like JavaScript, asynchronous requests, stuff that's going on in your background. We can look at those and you can see a nice pretty graph where, you know, every 10 seconds on here we get a little spike. And that we can tell that there's stuff going on in the background there that are these timing requests.
So that that might be very interesting, or it might be really uninteresting. You know, it might be a banner ad, I don't care, or it might be something like an AJAX request, sending or submitting data or whatever, and that might be incredibly important. That might be the only thing I'm interested in. So by a series of subtraction, we're now looking at the exact things that we're interested in or not interested in, and, you know, getting rid of the chaff, sort of.
Yeah. If on a particular site you have one page that actually has this type of data on it, well, now you know they're on that page, right?
Yeah. You can map out where they are specifically on which part of the domain. So this really kind of comes down to, can you map this out ahead of time? If you can map out the domain ahead of time, you get a ton of advantages as an attacker. So let's say it's like a YouTube site or something. YouTube's a horrible example. A bank, where I might be able to have a bank account or something, get an example, where I can go through and actually check every single page, see what they are, see what the size bytes, see what sort of requests they typically make in the browser, and so on. If I know that ahead of time, then I can really dramatically reduce the likelihood of my not knowing where they are on the site, which gives me some significant advantages. So one thing is, can you prefetch can you force the user to prefetch the content? So if it's something that's cacheable content like images, CSS, JavaScript, that's not particularly helpful to know where they are on the site, then it's great. You know, I can create a little iframe and a side channel, like think about it like a separate tab or something. That separate tab, I can iframe in this exact same site or the exact same objects or whatever, and you're downloading them into your browser and they're being cached. So that data will not be requested again, or a much smaller chunk will be requested instead of the gigantic size. Or I might not want to cache it at all in the case where it's a very specific size. So if it's an image and it's exactly 51,000 bytes or something, like a kind of a weird number, well, that's great. Then I know when I see something coming across the wire that's around 51,000 bytes, well, you probably are on that exact page with that one piece of content. So it depends a little bit on what the site looks like. One of the most important things is to figure out how did they get there and how did they leave, because that gives you two pieces of a puzzle. So let's say they visited 10 pages. Well, if you know the first and you know the last, now you only have to figure out 8 more pages. One thing you can do is figure out, okay, well, if they were on, you know, bank.com and they're about to click a button that says HTTPS bank.com, well, you know that they're landing on the home page of that bank. If they're leaving the domain and they go to some site that they're clicking off, you know, you say thank you for your order, click here to go to somewhere else, or whatever, screw off, go somewhere else. Well, if you know that that link only exists in one place in that site, you've now reduced that total likelihood of unknowns to the stuff in the middle. Known HTTP headers and SSL headers are really valuable. So I can force the user to come to my SSL TLS enabled website and basically figure out what HTTP headers they're going to send, what sort of encoding they're going to use, and so on, to dramatically reduce the amount of stuff I need to look at. I know exactly what the byte size is. I know exactly what I'm looking at, and so on. Also, DNS queries and host headers are all in plain text. I don't think a lot of people realize that even when you're making an SSL TLS handshake, it's sending the host header in there. So just man in the middle, I can just watch and see what host you're visiting. That kind of leaks a little information, but also embedded third-party objects. So if there's an image that's hosted by Akamai or something as a static dot whatever, a lot of big websites use those, for instance. If it's only certain things hosted in certain websites, I can kind of tell where you are on the site as you traverse through it, because I can see you pulling that third-party content as you're traversing the website. And of course, if they're not encrypted content over SSL, then I can either win in the case of JavaScript, CSS, where I can actually change the DOM, or if it's an image tags, at least I know where you are. I can tell exactly where you are and what you've downloaded and so on. So a lot of these techniques, not all, but a lot of them rely on an asynchronous tab. So you have, let's say Firefox for instance, you have a tab sitting there that's over HTTP. A man in the middle can completely change the DOM, do whatever they want. They've got complete control over it. And a separate one that's in focus, the one that the user's actually interacting with, that's the SSL TLS enabled website. So users often surf like this. They don't realize that the attacker is still in control of their browser, just because they don't see that happening in the background. So one thing you can do is do SSL timing based on pre-cached images. Figure out how long it takes them to render something. So Chris Evans had a great write-up on this, guy from Google. He basically said if you have a bunch of images, let's say an image, and you make a bunch of requests to it over and over again, well, if the first time was really fast, and it's comparatively always fast, well, then you know that they visited before. But if the first time is slow and the next bunch of times are really fast, then you know they haven't been there before. So you can sort of figure out where they've been on the site as you want to check that question. You can also use cross-site request forgery on most sites to log people out, which is kind of not interesting. I'll show you why it's more interesting later. But being able to do cross-site request forgery and force someone out of their flow and back into login, if I kind of lost where they were as they were traversing through the site, I can force them to log out and get them back to login page. So it's a known state, I know where they are, and then as they traverse out again, I can sort of get control back and figure out where they're going. The %-- and security equals are things you can do inside of iframe. So if I have bank.com // slash %-, that's kind of not really solid URL encoding. So the web server will barf and say, I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. Well, in that case, you're sending HTTP headers, you're sending cookies, you're sending the GET request and so on. So I can kind of reduce all this stuff in the middle. Like I know that this is what's coming across the wire. I know exactly how big the response is going to be and coming back from 400 response. If I use security equals restricted, I'm not sending cookies. I'm also not rendering JavaScript or objects or whatever. So I can kind of get multiple states. If I use an iframe with the %-, and an iframe with security restricted, I get 3 states of sort of the same web page, which can give me a lot of inference about what's going on there. These are really minor issues in NoScript. I kind of debated not even talking about them, but they are a lot of people use NoScript, so I figured it was worth talking about. But NoScript sets these cookies, which was totally destroying some of my tests. It sets these cookies pop under with a capital P and lowercase p. And actually I think it sets like 2 or 3 more now. It's actually been increasing, so that needs to go away. But it only sets it on HTTP land and only when JavaScript is enabled. So you can't. It's not like it sends it on the server, but if you actually ask the DOM, tell me what the cookies are, it'll show this pop under and a couple others. But they survive deletion. You can't get rid of them. So if I'm a man in the middle and I ask, do you have pop under and pop under, then I know that you've got NoScript. And more importantly, I know that JavaScript is enabled on the HTTPS site because there's really no separation between the HTTP and HTTPS versions of that site as far as NoScript is concerned. It's that once you enable, by default, you can actually change this, but by default it'll enable in both HTTPS and HTTP. So even though the user is thinking I'm only enabling on the HTTPS site, they're actually enabling it for the bad guy on the HTTP version of that same website. So in the side channel they've got control of that and they can start interacting with the browser and so on. Like I said, pretty minor issues. It also doesn't respect ports, which is somewhat useful in a later example. So yeah, so there's a bunch of different things you could potentially do to try to figure out what the history of that user is as they're going through that flow. One that totally doesn't work is using document.refer in JavaScript space. That'd be nice, but it doesn't work. You can use CSS history, but this does, if you use the typical examples, you actually have to refresh and reload the page over and over, which in certain browsers makes clicking sounds and so on. There might be a way around it. I'm sure there is a way around it. We just didn't go any further than that. And then history length upon entrance and exit. So if you say, ask the user's browser, what's your history length? They go through the SSL flow, and then you ask it again at the end, you know how many pages. You just take the difference between those two numbers, you know how many pages they visited as they went through that flow. So if there's a very specific way to get through this flow and it takes this many pages, you know that they must have gone through that flow. That'll come up again later too. So this is my slide of fail. None of this worked. It sort of worked, but we were thinking about ways to exhaust the amount of data going across the wire so that we could just look at the things we're actually interested in, which is, you remember when Josh was saying, you have a lot of ports, they're making a lot of requests and a lot of data going down each one of those ports. Well, that's really annoying when you're trying to figure out which page you're on, and are you making many requests, or are you making one big request, or what's going on there. So we thought, well, maybe we can meter the traffic, kind of slow it down, congest it in some way, and just get the data that we want to see on the wire. Well, the first one we tried was using Pylorus, because it's SSL is thread safe in Python, where it's not with my original version, which is Perl. But you basically take n-1, so let's say it's 256 ports, you take 255 ports, and you lock up 255 ports on the server. So the user's browser can't make multiple connections. It has to do over one port. Unfortunately, this is really not very effective. It sort of works. I mean, I'm sure someone who spent a lot more time thinking about it would get better results than I did. But first of all, it requires Apache. It requires no load balancing, so this is not going to work on like a high-end web server or something. And it also requires that there's not a lot amount of users on the system, because if there are, they're going to lock up that one remaining port, and then the user gets DOSed. So that's not particularly useful. So the other way we tried, well, so if you can't DOS the server, what if you can DOS the client? And this I got working slightly better. So we actually used a bunch of CSS image link tags, going and making requests to something that's returning a chunked encoding, which means it's basically delaying the browser. And can we sort of exhaust it? Well, we ran into all kinds of problems. The first one is that the browser, when you're making if you exhaust like HTTP port, just port 80 or something, it doesn't actually affect what's going on in HTTPS land for some reason. I was like, what? Why isn't this working? Well, it turns out that it kind of uses a finite number for the total amount of requests it can make over a single port, but it also has a bigger number, and I didn't know what that number was at first, of a total pool of complete requests that can make across the entire browser instance. Well, I took a guess and I said it was probably about 130, because I ran into this problem when I was writing Slowloris, and it turned out I totally did not need it. So we basically made 26 open ports, different web servers running on different ports, to try to exhaust all 130, 6 per port, so it's like 26 open or something. Different web servers. So we didn't need that. It didn't need anywhere near that. We only needed 30 open connections at a time to exhaust all of the browsers. So we needed somewhere around 6 open ports to do this. So then you have a whole bunch of link tags making chunked encoding requests, and they're really slow, and so the user's browser is basically locked up and can only make one request at a time, which you'd think would work great. Well, unfortunately, typical web pages have all kinds of crazy content on it, and if you are metering it to the point where you can really see what's going on, at least in my tests, it really locks up the browser. The browser just, it feels like there's something wrong with the web server, and the user would probably bail at that point, just give up or whatever, because it's so slow, unless there was some other reason they would think it's slow. I'm sure someone who spent more time could figure out a way to speed that up and make it look less seamless to more seamless to a user, but I had all kinds of fail doing it. So.
All right, so the next thing that we're talking about is using delayed pop-ups. And this is basically a way to manipulate manipulate the user who thinks they're secure using HTTPS. And so in this particular example, what we've done is we've used JavaScript on the HTTP version of the page, and this JavaScript basically says, once you click on me, then execute the JavaScript. So in this example, what we've done is we've done a Firefox pop-up XPI, so a Firefox extension essentially. The user goes, they click on the link to the secure site, and now that site prompts you with Firefox prevent this site from asking you to install the software, right? Do you want to allow the software install, yes or no?
What is this site though? What is it referring to?
So if you look here, if you look at the URL in the browser, it says HTTPS www.sectheory.com. So it looks like this is coming from SecTheory, the site that I visited, and it looks like it's in the secure domain. Well, what's actually, according to the message, it's even coming from sectheory.com right there. What's actually happening is under the scenes, this is coming from a completely different domain.
No, it's actually coming from this. It's coming from the same domain, just different.
Yeah, so it's coming over HTTP, right? And then once you click allow, there's also going to be another message with the real one, right? And then on the next slide, the delayed pop-ups here, we did something slightly different where we used basic authentication. So it's prompting the user, hey, you have to authenticate here. And so as an attacker, you can basically sniff out their credentials and figure out what their username and password is.
Most people would probably fall for this unless they were really not accustomed to this type of dialogue. I'm not sure, probably no one in this room would fall for it probably, but your mom probably would, so.
So in our third example, we've basically done the same thing, but we've used an exe file. And so you'll click on the secure side, it'll go and it'll prompt you, in Firefox at least, it'll prompt you to download the exe file. And you can decide yes or no whether I want to download that file. Well, in Google Chrome, it just automatically downloads that exe file. So as a Chrome user, you're going to go to a site, you're going to think you're going to the secure site, and then all of a sudden the secure site is downloading an exe executable to your system. So probably not something good.
So the next version, this actually demo is not at all how an attacker would normally do it, but just for visualization, this is how we wrote it. Normally, this wouldn't do a data colon at all. It would just send you to another domain that user has, that the attacker has access to, rather. But what this does essentially, and they probably wouldn't use a set timeout. Maybe they would, but probably not. They would probably do it initiated by whenever they felt, when the attacker felt like they wanted to know how many pages the user had visited. So what this does is every once in a while, it'll force that user to go to a user-controlled page, and that page would say, all right, how many pages, or what's your document.history? What's the length of your history? And so, okay, it finds the answer, and then it'll immediately redirect you back to wherever you were before. So what happens is, as the user's surfing, the bad guy can sort of force them out of HTTPS and force them back in, figure out how many pages they visited, and from the user's perspective, it just flashes white, flashes back to the same page. So it looks almost like a screen flicker. But gradually, as you go further through the flow, it keeps happening, and the user kind of, the attacker rather, can kind of tell exactly how many pages you visited at every single checkpoint along that path, which can give you tons of insight about how far they've gone. This is actually very similar to the XSHM, jeez, these acronyms, but exploit on a WASP website, except this one follows you along, which is much nicer for this type of thing. So these are a bunch of minor issues in my opinion, but they could lead to some bad stuff. So there's a bunch of autocomplete stuff built into Chrome and Firefox, and I'm sure other browsers are picking up as well, where you type in something and you're not fully complete with the domain, but it's asking Google specifically, like, what do you think I'm trying to type? So as you're typing stuff out, even if Google is not like your DNS provider, they're still getting that information, which is a huge information leak. But from a man-in-the-middle perspective, it doesn't really give you much because you're already a man-in-the-middle, you're already seeing DNS and stuff, so it's not really giving you that much data in that context. Well, if the user doesn't type a slash in there, but they're kind of typoing stuff and they're typing too fast or whatever, they can end up sending a lot more data than they want. Again, a very minor issue, so probably not that useful. But if the user doesn't understand basic, if they're reading some old documentation or something that says, okay, type your username and password in this format, information will also be sent across the wire. Even if it doesn't work in the browser, it's still being sent out to Google. So in plain text. So the bad guy will actually see the username and password going across the wire. Probably not that common, but it certainly could happen. And Google gets that information too, which is also bad. The DNS prefetching as well. So I thought this worked, and then I thought it didn't work, and then I thought it worked again. Well, it turns out it only works if you're using a local proxy. It might work if you're using a remote proxy too, but you have to use a proxy. In Chrome, if there's a bunch of like, let's say href tags on the page, it will actually go and ask the DNS provider, okay, what's the IP for this ahead of time to speed up the browsing experience. Well, imagine, I'm a jealous boyfriend and my girlfriend, she's looking at her webmail and she's using a local proxy for some reason, which is this is not super useful. But let's say she was for some reason, and I'm actually monitoring the wire. At some point, I see, the domain for her ex-boyfriend or something. Well, now I know that she's reading an email from her ex-boyfriend. So there could be some information leaks there that it could leak, intranets and all kinds of other stuff potentially. So hat tip to Mike Andrews. He was very close to figuring this out. And actually, he wrote quite a bit about it on Foundstone. So you can go check that out as well. But basically, HTTP cookies can overwrite HTTPS cookies. You can set HTTPS cookies from HTTP land, but more importantly, you can overwrite existing HTTPS cookies. So that whole integrity thing just goes right out the window. And this has always been for usability. Cookies don't follow the same security model that JavaScript does for many reasons, but ultimately it makes the browser a lot less secure when you're talking with certain types of websites. So the original thing we thought of is, okay, well, because we're still thinking about how much data is going across the wire, how can we kind of manage and see that and whatever. Well, what if we made the cookies gigantic, super huge, and a very specific number? So if we ever saw that specific number crossing the wire, then we knew it was going in that direction. We knew it was a request being made because that's a cookie going across the wire. As opposed to the data coming back if it's a smaller file or whatever. So that, it sort of worked. Yeah, we can prove that it sort of works, and I'll give you some examples of why it stopped working when we got to a certain size. It could potentially lead to cross-site scripting, yeah. So if actually a bunch of examples of, hello so-and-so, and the cookie is so-and-so. It's not used as a security mechanism. It's used to be nice and friendly to the user. They don't sanitize it because there's no point, because how would a bad guy set that cookie? Well, it could lead to cross-site scripting. Still not that interesting, but it could potentially happen. It could lead to offsite redirects if you're talking about authentication, yeah. So still not that interesting. But it gets more interesting. Okay, what if I could, if they have an existing authentication credential, let's say it was called auth or something, could I set overwrite that cookie and log them out? Again, why would I want to log them out? Well, maybe I would get them back to that login page. It gets more interesting though. What if I could actually beat them to that page? So let's imagine I know they're about to click on a page, and I say, okay, I'm going to go to that page, that authentication page, grab the cookie ahead of time, and replay it in that person's browser before they go there. Well, if the type of site is not the kind of site where it resets the cookie, you're going to end up with a scenario where the good guy logs in, they type in their username and password, it ties that username to the credential that's being sent, and suddenly they're logged in with a credential the attacker knows. So the attacker just puts it in his own browser, logs in, and boom, you're in the account. And so any IP restrictions you have in place, any sort of like browser sniffing or whatever, it just doesn't work because is a man in the middle, so he can surf on the same connection. Everything's exactly the same. He knows all the same parameters that you know. So, so you can very easily, in certain circumstances, break into people's accounts using this type of system, knowing with basically no prior knowledge. I talked with Microsoft and with Firefox about this, like cookie clobbering, and should it even be allowed? And from their perspective, they said, well, no, it's clearly bad, but how do you really fix that? And so we went back and forth, and they said, well, yeah, maybe we should fix that or whatever. But it turns out, I don't know if you guys saw Jeremiah's speech. Unfortunately, I had to miss it. But he can basically clobber all your cookies. So you can overwrite the cookie jar with about 50 domains or 60 domains or something. He can overwrite all the cookies that are allowed within your browser. Well, by doing that, now if there was any sort of limitations in the browser, I've blown them away and I can set my cookie again. So, the cookie clobbering thing is going to be around for quite a while, I think. There's really no way to build an isolated container. And if you tried to, you might create a condition where you could actually DOS the web server, or DOS the client rather. So So here's where we get to the interesting stuff. So remember I said we made these really gigantic cookies and it stopped working at a certain point? Well, it turns out if you set over a certain size cookie, it's not not the browser that cares anymore. It's the web server. The web server actually says, whoa, that's way too big. There's no way I can handle that size. It's outside the spec, or whatever. Maybe you're trying to buffer overflow or whatever. So it gives this type of request thing back, bad request. Not gonna complete it. So sure, I could DOS the entire website, but that's not particularly interesting. I mean, I could just stop them from going there. I'm a man in the middle, right? Just reset packets in both directions. But I can actually set a path on cookies as well. So if I put a path as /JS or some frame busting protection code or /logout or /report abuse or whatever, I can basically force that user to never go to those specific web pages. So if that was the client-side protection that was protecting them, it's now gone. It just doesn't exist at that point from their perspective. And a lot of that type of code that I'd be interested in is probably the kind of code that the user doesn't actually see anyway. It's more like it's a AJAX request or something, or it's being pulled in, included into the page or whatever. So it's probably not something they'd even notice unless they were watching the wires. So only a sophisticated user would even understand that. So where does knowing the login state actually help? Is there any point? And there is. And is there a scenario where using wildcards can actually work against you? So wildcards are used primarily by big websites who have lots of subdomains and they want to kind of do it cheaply. So this typically only affects larger things. But if I can't steal the cert, if I can't break into the machine and steal the cert, what else can I get out of that? Well, it turns out you can do this, for lack of a better term, double DNS rebinding, where in certain circumstances where you have cross-site scripting and wildcard certs, not cross-site scripting on the main domain, but cross-site scripting on a different unrelated subdomain. It's same domain, different subdomain. So this is the banking website, and this is their marketing website that's over SSL, over SLTLS, but it's not secure. It's like, who cares? Like even if it got broken into, with the exception of the wildcard cert, there's really no value there. So having a cross-site scripting in there, maybe it's useful for phishing. Maybe I can override a cookie or something. But other than that, really not that useful. In certain circumstances, let's say I want to attack, let me give you a concrete example. Addons.mozilla.org. Let's say I wanted to break into that thing, and I'm man in the middle, and there's somebody who has access to addons.mozilla.org. Well, let's assume they use something like secure cookies. They're smart guys, right? They probably use secure cookies. And they're not going to, because they don't want anyone to downgrade you using Moxie Marlin Spike's tool. So they've basically done everything right. There's no cross-site scripting there. Let's just say it's secure. That subdomain is secure. Now let's assume they have a different subdomain called mxr.mozilla.org, which exists, and that has cross-site scripting on it, and it has a wildcard, and it doesn't care about host headers. So sort of a trifecta of kind of weird things. So it still doesn't seem like that really give you much, but it can. So in this example, the man in the middle controls everything except the SSL connection itself. So they can't man in the middle, but they can't man in the middle of the SSL connection, but everything else. So here's how it works. So the victim requests the IP address for addons.mozilla.org, and the attacker modifies the DNS time to live to 1 second. So basically gives them the exact same DNS packet they normally get, except it's modified to be 1 second instead of 30 minutes or whatever it is. The victim logs into addons.mozilla.org. This is where the login detection becomes important, because I don't want to do this attack until they've logged in. I want them to have that cookie. It's very important. So at this point, the attacker firewalls off the IP address to addons.mozilla.org and forces the URL to go to addons.mozilla.org. So this is where the cross-site scripting lives, except it's the wrong subdomain, if you notice. It's not MXR where the actual XSS lives. It's the wrong subdomain. It's very important. So this particular example, you actually have to do clickjacking to get it to work. They've actually fixed this cross-site scripting hole, but yeah, this is a real example, by the way. But the host name is wrong. But the reason this works is because it uses a wildcard cert, and it doesn't care about host headers. So it could be addons.mozilla.org from its perspective. It has no reason to believe it's not. It's not programmed to say it's not or do anything different. So it just magically serves up the same content it would normally serve up on mxr.mozilla.org with the wrong subdomain in the host headers. So the victim requests a DNS for addons@mozilla.org because they're firewalled off and they can't make the request. The attacker sets DNS TTL for 1 second again, but this time they return the IP address of MXR instead of addons.mozilla.org. The victim runs a cross-site scripting in context of addons.mozilla.org. Still doesn't give me anything. So if the attacker, if the addons.mozilla.org doesn't use HTTP only, sure, I could pull out the cookie in JavaScript space. But again, let's pretend that they're secure and they're not going to do that, right? They're smart guys. They're not going to do that. Well, at this point, I basically turn it on its head. I say, okay, I want you to rebind again. So I firewall them off. I unfirewall them from the previous firewall instance. I force them to rebind back, and they request the addons.mozilla.org IP address again. The attacker delivers the IP address for addons.mozilla.org. The victim's cookie is sent to addons.mozilla.org. Which I still can't read, but now it's in context of the right IP address. So they're really on addons.mozilla.org. They're really sending real content, but now my JavaScript is running. So I have a beef shell or whatever that can see or download or whatever, and I have complete control. I can do whatever I want, upload content or whatever. So I talked to Mozilla guys about that. They fixed the XSS, but they're like, well, why would we ever look for cross-site scripting on a domain that we don't care about, their search thing? Well, this adds kind of an interesting extra dimension if you're like doing like PCI audits or whatever. You actually do need to check every single subdomain that's under that domain, especially if they're using SSL, because they could either steal the cert or they could do something crazy like this. What are the chances of them doing something like this? Well, I talked with Ivan Ristic, who's done a bunch of SSL metrics, and he said about 10% of certs are wildcard certs, and let's say 80% of websites have XSS, so 8%. And then I was talking with the CISO Andy from Akamai, and he said, because they're the ones who host a lot of this stuff, and he said, well, they always respect host headers. So let's say it's anywhere between 2 and 4% is probably a good guess of sites that would be vulnerable to it. Unfortunately, they tend to be very, very large websites that tend to be vulnerable to it. For instance, Mozilla.org. So one of my guys, he's like, I was telling them in this example, and he's like, well, thank God I use Perspectives. And Perspectives is a tool in Firefox that's supposed to say, okay, well, if you have a whole bunch of different people telling the centralized server what they saw when they went to a certain domain, well, you can check and see if you've been man-the-milled. They can either do, for packet, it's really meant for packet forensics. See if somebody is man-the-middling you and actually changing the cert. Well, what the problem is, it's really easy to detect that this plugin is installed because it's making a whole bunch of HTTP, interestingly enough, HTTP requests out to the server. So you're thinking, well, how does that really help an attacker? I mean, if they're running it, knowing that it's there doesn't really give you much because you're going to not do, you're just not going to do the attack. Either way, the good guy wins, right? Because you're not going to do the attack. Either you get caught doing it or you're not going to do it. Well, that's not really true. The problem is it only checks the parent domain. It doesn't check any of the embedded content. So if like a lot of sites have static dot or whatever, static images, JavaScript, CSS, well, as long as it's CSS or JavaScript and not images, I don't really care about images, but as long as I can modify the DOM with objects or whatever, I can basically take control over that page and inject anything I want on it, see what's going on, read the content, and so on. So if I'm a true man-in-the-middle bad guy, I don't need to man-in-the-middle of the primary domain and get caught. I can man-in-the-middle of the static content that's being included and get basically the same thing. So we tried this against the wildcard cert concept that we just talked about, and it gave like a little frowny face or thumbs down or something in the corner, and it's a little red thing. It's really hard to, unless you're really paying attention to it, it really is not a big enough visual cue to let you know what's going on. And by the way, if you actually look at all the kind of default stuff inside Perspectives, it's really not designed. It's basically everything that should be checked isn't checked. It's all kind of backwards. So I don't recommend this tool for protecting yourself. There's another one called SS Elvis that just came out. Someone told me about it. I have not had a chance to check it. I bet it has a lot of similar issues. This technology needs a lot of work before it's going to be fixed.
So Microsoft research said, in fact, as far as we can determine, there's no evidence of a single user being saved from harm by a certificate error, anywhere, ever. Thus, to a good approximation, 100% of certificate errors are false positives. Now, people could counter this and say if there were no warnings, then man-in-the-middle type attacks would be far more rampant. In reality, I think Robert and I agree more with the Microsoft research guys here. More importantly, we still don't think that helps because a user can click through the warnings. Most users are kind of trained, certificate error, okay, right? Or there's ways to use the warnings to an attacker's advantage. So really, they don't help. Which leads us to the next slide.
So we want to try to figure out a way, how can we actually use this warning to an attacker's advantage? And because it really, if I'm going to man in the middle somebody, if they click through, I win. If they don't click through, it's probably because they've caught me. So how can I like check and kind of get that information out of them about what sort of user they are? Well, let's say, remember that previous example where I had YouTube, which is SSL YouTube. Well, if I gave you a link to SSL YouTube, you're probably going to click on, I mean, what's the worst that's going to really happen to you? Rickroll you or something? So you probably click on it. Maybe you won't click on it if I send it to you, but if someone, your buddy sends it to you, you think it's your buddy anyway, sends you HTTPS youtube.com, and you're a security researcher, you'll look at it and you'll say, well, yeah, it's weird. I'll check on it. Oh, it's Google. It's wildcard. So Google clearly can't make a website. But it's no malicious stuff. It's nothing bad. It's just bad web design. So that kind of person is going to go through that flow extremely slow, because they're going to go and check and like figure out what's going on. Whereas a typical user, will go through it very fast. Like, yeah, I want to see the midgets or whatever, right? I want to click. So by measuring the timing difference, I actually inferred what sort of user you are. And so although I didn't man-in-the-middle you at that point and actually take control of that SSL session, of which it was not useful anyway, because it just redirects you back to Google, which is odd. But anyway, because it's YouTube. But the user who goes fast, I now know, and future times when I want to, on his bank or whatever, I can put my snake oil cert in there or whatever. Who cares? He's going to click through it super fast because it's that kind of user. And there's a much lower chance of me getting outed because I was able to test and see what sort of user you were ahead of time. Pretty cool. So, all
right, so fear, uncertainty, and doubt aside, be aware, there's probably way more issues here than we've found or discussed today. That said, we spent about 5 months looking into this, and if we found all these issues, just imagine how many other issues are out there.
I've got a full-time job, by the way. This is just part-time stuff, you know.
So someone who actually spent the time actually enumerating all these issues, going through all the different vectors, they'd probably be rewarded with dozens of additional issues.
I actually believe it's more like in the hundreds. I don't have any proof or anything, but if you think about all the plugins and all the weird stuff that websites do, and encoding issues and all the stuff you can inject, and flash cookies which have their own potential issues, and so on and on and on and on, I believe there's probably more like hundreds of things left to find. So good for researchers.
And it's probably worth mentioning once again, you still need to be a man in the middle for any of this stuff to work.
Yeah, I talked to a couple reporters and they're like, well, yeah, but how do you do this? Well, the only time SSL ever matters is when you are a man in the middle. So you sort of have to take a leap of faith and say, okay, somehow they got in the middle. I'm at an internet key. I'm at DEF CON, right? So someone's in the middle, and I don't know who it is. The last mile is the dangerous part. If they're not in the man in the middle, there are so many easier types of attacks anyway. They probably not opt towards any of these types of things. They still could, and I think you could probably write tools around all these concepts and build a lot of this stuff out without having to do this by hand, which is what we were doing. I really don't want people to go away and say, oh, the sky was falling. It's really not. It's not that bad. You should still use SSL TLS. It still is a okay security mechanism, not for a determined attacker, but for a lazy, passive person who's just seeing what data you're sending in clear text. It gives you protection from that kind of guy. But with proper tab, ports, cookie sandboxing, and better SSL, TLS, padding, and jitter, a lot of these issues could go away. Unfortunately, yes, this definitely does mean you absolutely have to upgrade all your browsers and all of your web servers to get to the next version of whatever that version would have that would introduce this extra padding and jitter. That also means extra latency on the internet for all this SSL, TLS traffic and so on. But it really, it's pretty frail right now. Let's put it that way. Yes, there needs to be a lot more sandboxing in the browser. Again, browsers are very frail. They were never designed to have this mixed content stuff and still be secure. They try to be, but realistically, there's just no way for them to do that appropriately. So either use a completely separate browser or you're kind of screwed.
So with that, I think we have about 3 minutes for questions if there are any.
That is amazing.
All right.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.